Amid the rush of the city, a millionaire stopped in front of a girl polishing shoes on the sidewalk. Something about her touched him, the delicate manner, the determined smile, and an old bracelet with his daughter's name. The very daughter he believed had been dead for 6 years. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing Chapter 1, The Encounter. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of Manhattan glistening under the pale afternoon light. Richard Thornton loosened his tie as he stepped out of the glass doors of the Goldman Tower, his mind still churning with the details of the merger meeting that had just concluded. Numbers, projections, stakeholder concerns, all of it swirled in his head like a storm that refused to settle. He was one of the most successful real estate developers in New York, a man whose name appeared regularly in the business section of major newspapers. Yet today he felt nothing but exhaustion. He walked briskly down Fifth Avenue, his polished Italian shoes clicking against the wet pavement. People rushed past him in both directions, each absorbed in their own worlds, their own struggles. Richard barely noticed them. His assistant had reminded him 3 times that morning about the charity gala that evening, an event he was expected to attend and smile through, shaking hands with people who wanted his money or his influence. The thought made him sigh. As he turned the corner onto a quieter side street, hoping to find a moment of peace before his driver arrived, something caught his attention, or rather someone. Sitting on a small wooden stool near the entrance of an old building was a young girl no more than 8 or 9 years old. She had a worn shoebox at her feet, filled with brushes, polish, and rags. A handmade sign propped against the box read, "Shoe Shine, $5," in careful, childish handwriting. The girl wore a faded pink jacket that looked too thin for the weather, and her dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. Despite her modest appearance, there was something remarkably bright about her. Her eyes, large and expressive, watched the passers-by with a mixture of hope and determination. When she noticed Richard slowing down, she immediately sat up straighter and offered him a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like your shoes shined?" "Best shine in the city, I promise," she said, her voice clear and confident despite her young age. Richard found himself stopping. He could not quite explain why. Perhaps it was the girl's earnest smile, or the way she held herself with such dignity despite her circumstances. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that tugged at a place in his heart he had locked away years ago. Without fully understanding his own impulse, he nodded. "Sure, why not?" he said, his voice softer than usual. The girl's face lit up with genuine joy. She quickly gestured to a slightly larger wooden box nearby that served as a makeshift seat for customers. Richard removed his expensive blazer, draped it over his arm, and sat down. The contrast was almost comical. A millionaire in a custom-tailored suit, sitting on a weathered box while a child prepared to clean his shoes. As the girl knelt down and began examining his shoes with professional seriousness, Richard observed her more closely. Her movements were practiced and efficient, as if she had done this hundreds of times before. She selected a brush and began working with careful attention to detail. "You are very good at this," Richard commented, surprising himself with the genuine interest in his voice. The girl glanced up briefly, her smile widening. "Thank you, sir. I have been doing this for almost a year now. My mom taught me. She said if you are going to do something, you should do it right no matter what it is." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Richard replied. He paused, then asked gently, "Is she nearby? Does she work here too?" The girl shook her head, focusing back on the shoe. "No, sir. She is at home. She is not feeling well these days, so I help by working. She used to clean houses and take care of people, but now she cannot do as much, so I do what I can." Richard felt something twist in his chest. This child, barely old enough to be in elementary school, was working to support her family. He thought of his own daughter, the one he had lost, and how different their lives had been. How different they should have been. "That is very responsible of you," he said quietly. "What is your name?" "Sophie," the girl replied, applying polish with steady hands. "Sophie Mitchell. What is yours?" "Richard." "Richard Thornton." Sophie looked up at him with curious eyes. "That is a nice name. Very proper. Are you a businessman, Mr. Thornton?" "I am. I work with buildings, buying and selling properties." "It is not as interesting as it sounds," Richard said with a slight smile. Sophie laughed softly. My mom says every job is interesting if you care about doing it well. She says even cleaning a floor can be interesting if you think about making someone's day better. Richard found himself genuinely smiling now, something he had not done in what felt like weeks. This little girl, with her simple wisdom and pure heart, was unlike anyone he had encountered in his high-powered world of business. Everyone he dealt with wanted something from him. But Sophie just wanted to do a good job shining his shoes. They continued talking as she worked. Sophie told him about school, about how she loved reading and math, about her dream of one day becoming a teacher. She spoke about the small apartment where she lived with her mother, about the neighbors who sometimes brought them food, about the library where she spent her free time because it was warm and full of books. Richard listened, truly listened, in a way he had not listened to anyone in years. There was something achingly familiar about this child, though he could not place what it was. Perhaps it was just the reminder of innocence, of goodness, of all the things his life had become too complicated to appreciate. As Sophie finished buffing his shoes to a brilliant shine, she sat back on her heels with satisfaction. There you go, Mr. Thornton, all done. What do you think? Richard looked down at his shoes. They indeed looked impeccable. You were right. Best shine in the city. You have real talent, Sophie. The girl beamed with pride as she stood up and brushed off her knees. It was then, in that simple moment, that everything changed. As Sophie reached down to put away one of her brushes that had rolled under the wooden box, she extended her arm fully, and the sleeve of her thin jacket slid back. Richard's world stopped. His breath caught in his throat. His heart seemed to freeze mid-beat. There on Sophie's small wrist was a bracelet. Not just any bracelet. A delicate, intricately designed piece in white gold with tiny diamonds forming a floral pattern. And engraved on the inside plate, though he could not see it from where he sat, he knew exactly what it said. Emily Thornton, April 18th, 2018. He knew because he had commissioned that bracelet himself years ago. He had designed every detail with a master jeweler in the Diamond District. It had been a birthday gift for his daughter Emily on her 3rd birthday. The bracelet was one of a kind, custom-made, irreplaceable. And it had disappeared along with Emily 6 years ago, during one terrible afternoon that had shattered his entire world. Richard's hands began to tremble. His vision blurred slightly, as emotions crashed over him like a tidal wave. That bracelet could not be here on this girl's wrist, in the middle of a Manhattan street. It was impossible. It was insane. Yet there it was, unmistakable, undeniable. Where did you get that bracelet? Richard's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Sophie looked at him with confusion, pulling her sleeve back down instinctively. It is mine. I have always had it, always. Richard's voice was stronger now, more urgent. Who gave it to you? The warmth in Sophie's expression began to fade, replaced by wariness. My mom said it is mine. She said it is the only thing from when I was very little. She told me never to take it off. Richard stood up abruptly, his expensive blazer falling to the ground unnoticed. His mind was racing, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He needed to understand. He needed answers. But even as his lawyer's mind tried to process this rationally, his father's heart was screaming a single, impossible truth. The eyes, the smile, the way she tilted her head when she talked. It was not just the bracelet. It was everything. This girl, this precious child sitting before him, could she possibly be his Emily? Sophie, please, I need you to tell me more about your mother. What is her name? Where do you live? This is very important. But the intensity in Richard's voice, the desperation in his eyes, frightened the child. Sophie's face showed fear now. She quickly began gathering her supplies, shoving them into her box with shaking hands. I have to go, she said, her voice trembling. I should not talk to strangers. My mom always says I need to be careful. Wait, please, I am not going to hurt you. I just need to understand about that bracelet. It is very important. Please, Sophie. Richard reached out instinctively, but the gesture only scared her more. Sophie grabbed her box and ran. She darted down the street with the speed and agility of a child who knew these streets well, disappearing around the corner before Richard could even think to follow. He stood there, frozen, his heart in pieces on the wet pavement, staring at the empty space where she had been. His blazer lay in a puddle at his feet. His perfect shoes, now brilliantly shined, reflected the grey sky above. And Richard Thornton, One of the most powerful men in New York fell to his knees on the sidewalk and wept for the first time in 6 years. Chapter 2. The Investigation. Richard remained on that sidewalk for several minutes, oblivious to the curious glances from passers-by. His driver had been circling the block looking for him, and when Marcus finally spotted his employer kneeling on the ground, he rushed over with alarm written across his face. "Mr. Thornton, sir, are you all right? Are you hurt?" Marcus helped Richard to his feet, retrieving the soaked blazer from the puddle. Richard shook his head, unable to form coherent words. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he tell anyone that he believed he had just found his daughter, the child everyone had told him was gone forever? They would think he had lost his mind. Perhaps he had. "Take me home, Marcus." "Now," Richard finally managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. The drive to his penthouse in Tribeca passed in a blur. Richard stared out the window, replaying every moment of his encounter with Sophie. The way she smiled, the cadence of her voice, the shape of her eyes, but more than anything, that bracelet. There was no possibility of it being a replica. He had worked with the jeweler to ensure the design was unique, proprietary. The man had signed a contract guaranteeing no duplicates would ever be made. When they arrived at his building, Richard went straight to his study, ignoring the greetings from his housekeeper. He pulled out a locked drawer in his desk, his hands still shaking as he entered the combination. Inside were things he had not looked at in years, things too painful to face. Photographs, medical records, police reports, and there, in a small velvet box, was the receipt and certificate of authenticity for the bracelet. He spread everything across his mahogany desk and stared at the photos of Emily, 3 years old in these pictures, her dark hair in pigtails, her smile bright and trusting. The resemblance to Sophie was undeniable, now that he allowed himself to truly see it. The same curve of the cheek, the same way her nose crinkled when she smiled. 6 years had passed. Emily would be 9 now. Exactly Sophie's age. Richard's mind went back to that horrible day 6 years ago. It had been a sunny afternoon in April. His wife Catherine had taken Emily to the park while he worked from home. They had returned around 4 in the afternoon, and Catherine had gone upstairs to rest with a headache. Their housekeeper at the time, Margaret Bennett, had offered to watch Emily play in their large backyard garden. Catherine had gratefully accepted. Richard had been on an important conference call in his office, doors closed. When the call ended an hour later, he went downstairs to check on his daughter. But Emily was not in the garden. Margaret was not there either. He searched the house, calling out, his concern mounting with each empty room. He found Catherine still sleeping upstairs, unaware. It was not until he went back down to the kitchen that he found a note on the counter in Margaret's handwriting. Took Emily to get ice cream. Back soon. But they never came back. Hours passed. Night fell. Richard called the police. The investigation revealed that Margaret had withdrawn all her savings that morning. Her apartment had been cleared out. Security footage from nearby stores showed her boarding a bus with a small child, heading out of state. But after that, the trail went cold. The police had done their best, but Margaret had planned well. She had vanished completely, and with her, Emily. Months turned into a year. The case grew cold. Richard and Catherine's marriage, already strained, collapsed under the weight of grief and guilt. She blamed him for working during that call. He blamed himself for trusting Margaret. Eventually, Catherine could not bear to stay in New York anymore and moved to California. They divorced quietly, 2 broken people who could no longer stand to look at each other because all they saw was their lost daughter. Richard had never stopped looking, not really. He had hired investigators, checked every lead, followed up on every possible sighting. But as years passed with no results, even his most dedicated private detective had gently suggested it might be time to accept that Emily was gone. The world was large, and a determined person could disappear if they truly wanted to. Richard had never officially given up, but he had learned to live with the constant ache of not knowing. Until today. Until Sophie and that bracelet brought everything roaring back to life. Richard reached for his phone with renewed determination. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for James Dawson, the private investigator he had worked with during the initial years after Emily's disappearance. James had retired from active investigation work, but Richard knew he still had connections throughout the city. "James, it is Richard Thornton. I need your help. I need it now. Within 2 hours, James was sitting in Richard's study, listening intently as Richard recounted the encounter with Sophie. The older man, his grey hair neatly combed and his expression serious, took notes and asked pointed questions. "You are certain about the bracelet?" James asked. "Absolutely certain. There is no doubt in my mind. It was Emily's bracelet, the same one that disappeared with her," Richard insisted. "And the girl's name is Sophie Mitchell. That is what she told me. She said her mother's name is Margaret, that her mother is not well, and that they live somewhere in the city. She works near 5th Avenue and 43rd Street. James nodded slowly. "Margaret. That is quite the coincidence, given your former housekeeper's name." "It is not a coincidence, James. I know it is not." The investigator studied Richard carefully. "I understand your hope, Richard, but I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this might not be what you think. People can look similar. Bracelets can be sold or stolen and end up anywhere. I do not want you to get hurt again." "Then help me find the truth," Richard said firmly. "If I am wrong, I need to know. But if I am right, if there is even the slightest chance that girl is my Emily, I cannot let her slip away again. I will not make that mistake twice." James saw the determination in his old client's eyes and knew there would be no dissuading him. "All right. Give me 24 hours. I will find out everything I can about Sophie Mitchell and her mother." True to his word, James returned the next evening with a manila folder thick with information. Richard barely let him sit down before demanding answers. "Her full name is Sophie Mitchell, age 9. She attends PS 116, a public school in Manhattan, though her attendance has been sporadic. She lives with a woman named Margaret Mitchell in a small apartment in a modest building on the Lower East Side. Margaret Mitchell works occasional cleaning jobs, but has been reportedly ill for the past several months. Neighbors describe Sophie as a sweet, hard-working child who helps support her mother." "Margaret Mitchell," Richard repeated, his jaw tightening. "What else did you find about her?" James pulled out a photograph and placed it on the desk. "This is from a database search. This is Margaret Mitchell." Richard stared at the photo and his blood ran cold. Older, thinner, her hair a different color and style, but unmistakable. It was Margaret Bennett, his former housekeeper. The woman who had taken Emily and vanished. "It is her," Richard whispered. "My God, it is really her." "There is more," James continued. "Margaret Bennett completely disappeared after Emily's abduction. She changed her name, forged new documents, created a new identity as Margaret Mitchell. She has been living in New York this whole time, hiding in plain sight in the masses of the city. The address I have is verified. They have been at that location for approximately 4 years." Richard stood up and began pacing, his mind racing. 4 years in the same place. 6 years total. She raised my daughter. She stole Emily and raised her as her own child. It appears that way, yes. But Richard, we need to be careful about how we proceed. This is a delicate situation. The girl, Sophie, she believes Margaret is her mother. She has no memory of you or her life before. If we move too aggressively, we could traumatize her further. "I know," Richard said, running his hands through his hair. "Believe me, I know. But I also cannot just let this continue. Every day that passes is another day my daughter lives a lie. Another day she is kept from her real family. What do you want to do?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and calm. "I want to approach her carefully. Not as a stranger making accusations or demands. I want to earn her trust. Let her get to know me. And when the time is right, when she is ready, then we reveal the truth." James raised his eyebrows. "That could take weeks or months." "Then it takes weeks or months," Richard replied. "I lost her once by not being careful enough, by trusting the wrong person, by not paying attention. I will not lose her again by rushing and scaring her away. This time I do it right." Over the next few days, Richard began a routine. Each afternoon he would go to the corner where Sophie set up her shoe-shine box. At first she was wary when she saw him approach, remembering their last encounter. But Richard was gentle and patient. He simply sat down and asked for a shoe-shine, paid her generously, and chatted about simple, non-threatening things. The weather, books she might like, how business was going. Slowly, gradually, Sophie's guard began to lower. She remembered him as Mr. Thornton, the nice businessman who gave good tips. She did not connect him to the man who had frightened her with intense questions about her. Bracelet. Richard never mentioned the bracelet again, though his eyes lingered on it every time he saw it on her wrist. He learned more about her during these conversations. Her favorite subject was math. She loved drawing, though she rarely had good supplies. She dreamed of traveling someday, seeing places beyond New York. She spoke fondly of her mother, describing how Margaret told her stories every night and made sure she did her homework even when she was tired. It broke Richard's heart and filled him with rage in equal measure. This child, his child, loved her captor. Margaret had stolen 6 years of Emily's life, 6 years of his life, and had built this false reality where she was the loving mother. How could he compete with that? How could he tear apart the only world Sophie had ever known? But he also saw the struggles. Sophie worked on the streets because they needed money. Margaret's illness, whatever it was, had made their situation more desperate. His daughter was living in poverty, working instead of playing, when she should have been growing up in comfort and safety with him. Richard knew the moment of truth would have to come soon. He could not continue this charade indefinitely. But he also knew he needed more than just his word and a bracelet. He needed Sophie to trust him enough to listen, to consider the impossible truth he would eventually have to tell her. And most importantly, he needed to be ready to handle whatever came next with all the love and patience his daughter would need to heal from this betrayal. Chapter 3. Building Trust. 3 weeks passed, and Richard's daily visits to Sophie's corner became as routine as his morning coffee. He found himself looking forward to these moments more than any business meeting or social engagement. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the way he would check his watch repeatedly after 3 in the afternoon, eager to leave the office. His assistant commented that he seemed lighter somehow, though still carrying a weight she could not quite identify. Sophie had grown comfortable with him. She now greeted him with a genuine smile when he approached, and their conversations had expanded beyond pleasantries. She told him about a math competition at school that she wanted to enter, but could not afford the registration fee. Richard immediately offered to pay it, but Sophie had shaken her head with a maturity beyond her years. "That is very kind, Mr. Thornton, but my mom says we should not take charity. She says we earn what we get." "But thank you," Sophie had said, her voice gentle but firm. Richard had felt both pride and heartbreak at those words. Pride that his daughter had such strong character, such dignity, heartbreak that she had been raised to refuse help when she clearly needed it. Instead, Richard found other ways. He began coming for shoe shines more frequently, sometimes twice a day. He brought his business associates to Sophie, recommending her services enthusiastically. He made sure she always had customers, and the tips were generous but not suspiciously so. Sophie's income increased, and with it, her confidence and happiness. One particularly chilly October afternoon, Richard arrived to find Sophie wearing the same thin jacket she always wore, her hands red from the cold. Without thinking, he had gone straight to a nearby store and purchased a warm winter coat, gloves, and a hat. When he returned, he placed them beside her with a casual explanation. "A client gave these to me as a gift, but they are too small. I thought they might fit you. It would be a waste to throw them away," he said. Knowing Sophie's pride would not allow her to accept them as charity. Sophie had looked at the items, then at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand his kindness. Finally, she smiled and accepted. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. You are very kind. I will take good care of them." As she put on the coat, Richard saw her eyes light up with delight at its warmth. It fit perfectly, of course, because he had carefully estimated her size. Watching her happiness at such a simple gift made his chest tight with emotion. During one of their conversations, Sophie mentioned that she loved to draw, but only had a few worn crayons and some paper she had taken from the school recycling bin. The next day, Richard brought a modest art supply set, again with the excuse that it had been left behind by someone at his office. Sophie's joy was uncontainable. She hugged the box to her chest and promised to show him her drawings. True to her word, the following week she brought a folder of her artwork. Richard looked through each page carefully, his heart swelling. There were drawings of flowers, of buildings, of people. But what caught his attention was a particular sketch of a garden. It was detailed beyond what he would expect from a 9-year-old, showing a beautiful space with roses, a fountain, and a bench under a tree. "This is beautiful, Sophie. What made you draw this?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophie looked at the drawing with a dreamy expression. "I do not know. I sometimes dream about a place like this, a big garden with lots of flowers. It feels familiar somehow, like I have been there before, but I know I have not. Mom says I have a good imagination." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. The garden Sophie had drawn was remarkably similar to the garden of his Westchester estate, the garden where Emily used to play. Could she have memories buried deep of her real home? He carefully handed the drawing back. "It is a lovely dream. Perhaps one day you will see a garden like this," he said softly. As the weeks continued, Richard noticed more things about Sophie that confirmed what his heart already knew. She had a habit of humming when she concentrated, the same tuneless melody that Emily used to hum. She tilted her head to the left when she was thinking hard about something, exactly as Emily had done. She had a small scar near her left eyebrow from a fall she claimed to have had when she was very young. Richard remembered that scar because he had been there when it happened, when 3-year-old Emily had tripped while running in the hallway. But beyond physical similarities and habits, there was something deeper. Richard felt a connection to this child that went beyond logic or evidence. There were moments when Sophie would laugh at something he said, and the sound would pierce his heart because it was so achingly familiar. Times when she would look at him with concern if he seemed tired, showing a caring nature that reminded him of the sweet, empathetic child Emily had been. One afternoon, Sophie surprised him with a question. "Mr. Thornton, do you have a family, kids?" Richard had prepared for this question, but still found it difficult to answer. "I had a daughter once. She would be about your age now." "Had?" Sophie's face showed concern. "What happened to her?" "She went away when she was very young." "I have not seen her in a long time," Richard said carefully, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she reached out and gently patted his hand, a gesture so innocent and kind that Richard nearly broke down. "I am sorry, Mr. Thornton. That must be very sad. I hope you find her someday." "I hope so too, Sophie. I hope so too," Richard whispered. That evening, Richard sat with James Dawson again, discussing the next steps. They had been gathering evidence, documenting everything. Photographs of Sophie wearing the bracelet, school records that showed discrepancies in her age documentation, neighbors' testimonies about when Margaret and Sophie had first appeared in the area. They had enough to go to the police, enough to start legal proceedings. But Richard hesitated. "She trusts me now," Richard explained to James, "but it is still a fragile trust. If I bring in authorities, if I tear her away from the only mother she remembers, it will traumatize her. She will see me as the person who destroyed her world, not the father trying to save her." "So what do you propose?" James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "I want to talk to Margaret first, alone. I want her to see that I have found them, that I know everything. And I want to give her the chance to make this right, to help Sophie through this transition, instead of being forcibly removed from her life." James looked skeptical. "Richard, this woman kidnapped your daughter. She has been lying to her for 6 years. What makes you think she will cooperate?" "Because she loves Sophie," Richard said simply. "I have watched Sophie talk about her mother. Whatever Margaret's crimes, whatever her motivations, she does love that girl. And if she truly loves her, she will want what is best for Sophie, even if it means losing her." "That is a generous interpretation," James said dryly. "Perhaps. But I need to try. For Sophie's sake, I need to try the gentle approach first. We can always bring in the authorities later if it does not work. But I cannot undo the trauma of armed officers showing up and dragging her away from the only home she knows." James sighed but nodded. "All right. But I am going to be nearby when you confront Margaret, and if anything seems dangerous, I am calling the police immediately." "Agreed," Richard said. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Sophie mentioned to Richard that her mother had been feeling a bit better, and that Sophie would not be working the next day because she wanted to spend time with her. She had said this with such happiness, so pleased that her mother was having a good day, that Richard had to smile despite the bitterness he felt toward Margaret. But then Sophie added something that changed everything. Mr. Thornton, you have been so nice to me. I would like you to meet my mom. Maybe you could come for tea tomorrow afternoon. She has been asking about the kind man who has been helping me. I told her you are like a guardian angel. Richard's breath caught. An invitation into their home, to meet Margaret face to face. It was exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for, yet it filled him with both anticipation and dread. This would be the moment of truth, the moment when everything would either fall into place or shatter irreparably. I would be honored to meet your mother. Sophie, Richard said, managing to keep his voice steady. What time should I come? Down 2 o'clock? We live in the Lower East Side. I will write down the address for you, Sophie said, pulling out a small piece of paper and carefully writing the information. As Richard took the paper, he noticed his hand was shaking slightly. Sophie noticed too. Are you all right, Mr. Thornton? You look pale. I'm fine, just a bit tired from work. I will see you tomorrow at 2, Richard assured her. That night, Richard barely slept. He rehearsed what he would say to Margaret 100 different ways. Should he be angry? Should he appeal to her conscience? Should he threaten her with legal action? Nothing seemed right. In the end, he decided he would simply tell the truth and see how she responded. The next afternoon, Richard stood outside the building in the Lower East Side. James parked in a car down the street with his phone ready. The building was old but well maintained, with a small garden area out front where some children were playing. Richard climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached apartment 3C, he paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. Sophie answered the door with a bright smile. Mr. Thornton, you came. Come in, come in. Richard stepped into the small apartment. It was modest but clean, with mismatched furniture and walls decorated with Sophie's drawings. The smell of tea and something baking filled the air. And there, standing in the narrow hallway leading to what must be the kitchen, was Margaret. She had aged considerably. Her hair, once dark brown, was now streaked with grey. Her face was thinner, lined with worry and what might be illness. But her eyes were the same, and in them, Richard saw the exact moment she recognized him. The colour drained from her face. Her hand gripped the wall for support. For several long seconds, neither of them moved or spoke, while Sophie cheerfully chatted about showing Richard her room. Sophie, honey, Margaret's voice was hoarse. Why don't you go get the cookies from the kitchen? Let me talk to Mr. Thornton for a minute. Sophie looked between them, sensing the sudden tension but not understanding it. Okay, Mom, she said slowly, before disappearing into the kitchen. The moment Sophie was out of sight, Margaret's legs seemed to give out. She sank onto the couch, her face in her hands. You found us, she whispered. After all these years, you finally found us. Richard closed the door and stood in the center of the small living room, his fists clenched at his sides. Did you really think you could hide forever? Did you think I would ever stop looking for my daughter? Chapter 4. The Confrontation. Margaret kept her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Richard remained standing, every muscle in his body tense, years of grief and rage threatening to explode. But he forced himself to stay calm, to remember that Sophie was just in the next room. That one raised voice could bring her running back. I never stopped looking, Margaret finally whispered, raising her head to look at him. Her eyes were red, tears streaming down her face. Not for one single day did I stop waiting for this moment. I knew it would come eventually. Then why? Richard's voice was low but fierce. Why did you do it? Why did you take my daughter? Do you have any idea what you put us through? What you put Emily through? Margaret flinched at the name. Her name is Sophie now. She does not remember being Emily. She does not remember you or her old life. She was so young. She was 3 years old, Richard hissed, taking a step closer. She had a family who loved her, a future, everything. And you stole it all. I know, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I know, and I have lived with that guilt every single day. But please, Mr. Thornton, you have to understand. I was not in my right mind. I was lost, broken. I had just... She stopped, struggling with her words. Just what? Richard demanded. Margaret took a shuddering breath. I had just lost a baby. My own daughter. She was stillborn 3 days before that afternoon. I held her in my arms for hours, and then they took her away and I felt like I had nothing left. No purpose, no reason to keep living. I was drowning in grief and I could not breathe. Richard's expression did not soften. And that gave you the right to take my child. No, Margaret said immediately. No, of course not. Nothing gave me that right. But that afternoon when I was watching Emily in the garden, something inside me broke completely. She was playing, laughing, so alive and beautiful. And I thought about my own baby, who would never laugh, never play. The grief became something else, something dark and desperate. I told myself I would just take her for a little while, just to feel what it was like to hold a living child again. She wiped her tears with shaking hands. But then I was on that bus and I kept going. I kept running. I forged documents, changed my name, moved to different cities. And Emily, she cried for you at first. She cried for her mama and dada. But she was so young and children adapt. After a few months, I became her mother. The memories faded. She stopped asking. Richard felt sick listening to this. The image of his 3-year-old daughter crying for him, confused and scared, while this woman pretended to be her mother, was almost more than he could bear. You destroyed her life. You destroyed my life, my wife's life. Our marriage ended because of you. Catherine could not live with the pain. We lost everything. I know, Margaret sobbed. I am so sorry. I have been sorry every day. But I also love her, Mr. Thornton. I know I have no right to, but I do. I have raised her, cared for her, sacrificed for her. She is my daughter now too, in every way that matters except blood. She is my daughter, Richard said, his voice trembling with fury. Blood is all that matters. You are a kidnapper, a liar. Sophie deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know who she really is. From the kitchen came the sound of dishes clinking. Both adults immediately fell silent, watching the doorway. Sophie appeared carrying a tray with teacups and a plate of simple cookies. Her smile was innocent, unaware of the storm raging between the two people she cared about. I made these cookies yesterday, Sophie said proudly, setting the tray on the small coffee table. They are not fancy, but Mom taught me her recipe. Please sit down, Mr. Thornton. Richard forced himself to sit on the worn armchair across from the couch. His hands were still shaking, but he accepted the teacup Sophie handed him. Margaret had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes were still red and her face pale. Sophie sat between them on the couch, looking happy and content. I am so glad you two are meeting. Mr. Thornton has been so kind to me. Mom, he brings me customers and always has interesting stories about his work. He sounds like a wonderful person, Margaret said, her voice barely steady. She looked at Richard with pleading eyes, silently begging him not to destroy this moment for Sophie. They made awkward small talk for the next 15 minutes. Sophie chattered about school, about a book she was reading, about her dreams of becoming a teacher. Richard watched her, memorizing every detail, every expression. This was his daughter, alive and well, sitting right beside him. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm him. Eventually, Sophie excused herself to use the bathroom. The moment she left the room, Margaret turned to Richard with desperate urgency. Please, she whispered, please do not tell her like this. Not today. She is not ready. And when will she be ready? Richard shot back quietly. In another 6 years. Another 12? Never? Sayus, I'm not asking you to wait that long. I know my time with her is over. I have always known this day would come. But please, let us do this carefully. Let me prepare her. Let me help her understand. Why should I trust you with anything? Richard asked bitterly. Because I love her, Margaret said simply. I know you do not want to hear that, but it is true. I love Sophie more than my own life. And if you truly love her too, you will do what is best for her, not what satisfies your anger toward me. Richard wanted to refuse, wanted to call the police right then and expose Margaret for what she was. But as he looked around the small apartment, at Sophie's drawings on the walls, at the evident care in every corner despite their poverty, he realized Margaret was right about one thing. Sophie loved her. This was the only mother she had ever known. Tearing them apart suddenly would devastate her. I want DNA tests done, Richard said finally. Official legal documentation. I want proof that can stand up in any court. I will cooperate with anything you need, Margaret agreed immediately. And I want to be part of telling her the truth. I will not have you spinning this story to make yourself look innocent. I would never do that. She deserves the whole truth. Sophie returned, and the rest of the visit passed in tense politeness. When Richard finally left, promising Sophie he would see her again soon, Margaret walked him to the door. In the hallway, out of Sophie's hearing, she grabbed his arm. Mr. Thornton, I need to tell you something else. I am sick. I have cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, possibly less. That is why Sophie has been working so hard. I cannot work anymore and we have no one else. Richard stared at her, processing this information. Part of him felt a dark satisfaction at her suffering, but another part, the part that had grown to care for Sophie's well-being, felt only concern for what this meant for his daughter. "Does Sophie know?" he asked. "She knows I am ill, but not how serious it is. I have been trying to protect her from that truth. But Mr. Thornton, that is why I am begging you to be careful. Sophie is going to lose me soon anyway. Please do not make it happen in a way that destroys her." Richard pulled his arm away from her grip. "You should have thought about that before you stole her." Over the next 2 weeks, Richard arranged for discreet DNA testing. He used his connections to have samples taken from Sophie during a routine school health screening, though it required some ethical gymnastics he was not proud of. The results came back exactly as he knew they would. Sophie Mitchell was Emily Thornton. The genetic match was 99.9%. His daughter was alive. Armed with this proof, Richard met with Margaret again, this time without Sophie present. They met in a small cafe far from the apartment, a neutral territory where they could speak openly. "The results confirm it," Richard said, sliding the documents across the table. "She is Emily, my daughter, and now we need to discuss how we move forward." Margaret looked at the papers but did not touch them. "I know. I have been preparing what to say to her, but I need more time. Please, just a few more weeks to help her adjust to the idea slowly." "No more weeks," Richard said firmly. "We tell her this weekend. Together. I have already arranged for child psychologists to be available for counseling, for whatever support she needs. But this cannot continue. Every day that passes is another day of lies." Margaret looked defeated but nodded. "This Saturday, then. You come to the apartment in the afternoon. I will tell her we need to have an important conversation. And you will tell her the truth," Richard insisted. "All of it. No sugarcoating, no excuses. I will tell her everything," Margaret promised, tears filling her eyes again. "But Mr. Thornton, please remember that she is a child. Whatever anger you have toward me, whatever punishment you think I deserve, please do not let it harm her. She is innocent in all of this." "I know that better than anyone," Richard said coldly. "She has always been innocent. She was innocent when you took her, and she is innocent now. Which is why I am doing this carefully instead of simply having you arrested." "Will you have me arrested?" Margaret asked quietly. Richard was silent for a long moment. "I do not know yet. Part of me wants to see you in prison for what you have done. But another part of me knows that Sophie loves you, and seeing you taken away in handcuffs would traumatize her further. My priority is Sophie, not revenge. At least not yet." "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "Do not thank me," Richard said sharply. "I am not doing this for you. Everything I do now is for Emily, for Sophie, for my daughter. You are just a complication I have to manage until she is stable enough to handle losing you." The words were harsh but true. As Richard left the cafe, he felt no satisfaction in Margaret's pain, only a grim determination to get his daughter back while causing her as little additional trauma as possible. He had waited 6 years for this moment. He could wait a few more days to do it right. That Saturday arrived with agonizing slowness. Richard barely slept the night before, running through every possible scenario, every way Sophie might react. Would she believe them? Would she be angry at him for disrupting her life? Would she hate him for taking her away from Margaret? He arrived at the apartment at exactly 2 in the afternoon. Sophie answered the door with her usual bright smile, but it faded when she saw his serious expression. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thornton?" she asked with concern. "Everything will be all right, Sophie. But your mother and I need to talk to you about something very important." "Is that okay?" Sophie looked uncertain but nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Margaret was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. She gestured for Sophie to sit beside her, and Richard took the chair across from them. "Sophie, honey," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "What we are about to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear, but I need you to know that everything I am about to say is the truth, and that no matter what, you are loved. You have always been loved." Sophie looked between them, fear beginning to show in her eyes. "Mom, you are scaring me." "What is wrong?" Richard leaned forward, his heart breaking at the confusion on his daughter's face. "Sophie, my name is Richard Thornton, But 9 years ago, before you were Sophie Mitchell, you were Emily Thornton. And I am your father. Chapter 5. The Truth Revealed. Sophie stared at Richard, her face frozen in confusion. For several long seconds she did not move, did not speak, barely seemed to breathe. Then she turned to Margaret with questioning eyes, clearly expecting her mother to laugh and say this was some kind of strange joke. But Margaret was not laughing. She was crying, tears streaming down her face as she nodded slowly. "It is true, sweetheart. Everything he said is true." "I do not understand," Sophie whispered, her voice small and frightened. "What do you mean I was Emily Thornton? My name is Sophie Mitchell. You are my mother." "We have always been together." "No, baby," Margaret said gently, taking Sophie's hands in hers. "We have not always been together, not from the very beginning. You came into my life when you were 3 years old. Before that, you lived with Mr. Thornton and his wife in a big house with a beautiful garden. You had a different name, a different life." Sophie pulled her hands away, shaking her head vigorously. "No, that is not true. I would remember. I would know if that happened." Richard's heart was breaking as he watched his daughter struggle with this impossible information. "You were very young, Sophie. Too young to remember clearly, but I remember everything. I remember the day you were born, the first time you smiled, the first word you spoke. I remember teaching you to walk, reading you bedtime stories, watching you play in the garden. I remember every moment until the day you disappeared." "Disappeared?" Sophie's voice was rising now, panic setting in. "What are you talking about?" "Mum, please tell him he is wrong, please." Margaret pulled Sophie close, holding her despite the girl's resistance. "I wish I could, sweetheart, but I cannot lie to you anymore. 6 years ago, I took you away from your real family. I changed your name, changed our life, and I have been hiding ever since. I did something terrible, and now the truth has found us." Sophie pushed away from Margaret, standing up abruptly. She backed away from both adults, her face a mixture of fear, confusion, and betrayal. "You are saying you kidnapped me?" "You stole me from my real parents?" The word kidnapped hung in the air like a bomb. Margaret flinched but did not deny it. "Yes, I did. I was not thinking clearly. I had just lost my own baby, and I was not in my right mind. But that does not excuse what I did. Nothing excuses it." "Oh my God," Sophie breathed, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh my God, everything has been a lie? My whole life?" "Not everything," Margaret said desperately. "My love for you was never a lie. The years we spent together, the things I taught you, the way I cared for you, that was all real. I may not be your biological mother, but I have been your mother in every other way." "How can you say that?" Sophie's voice cracked, tears beginning to fall. "You stole me. You are a liar. Everything you ever told me about who I am was fake." Richard stood up slowly, wanting to go to Sophie but not sure if his approach would be welcome. "Sophie, I know this is overwhelming. I know you are scared and confused, but I want you to know that I have been looking for you every day since you disappeared. I never gave up hope, and now that I have found you, I want to be part of your life again. I want to be your father." Sophie turned to him, her young face aged with the weight of what she was learning. "You are a stranger. I do not know you. How can you be my father when I do not even remember you?" "I understand that," Richard said gently. "You do not remember me, but I remember you. And I have proof, if you want to see it. I have photographs, videos, your baby blanket, toys you played with, and that bracelet you wear, the one you said you have always had. I gave that to you on your 3rd birthday, 2 months before you disappeared. I had it specially made just for you." Sophie looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, as if seeing it for the first time. Her fingers touched the delicate gold, tracing the design. "This was from you?" "Yes, it has your real name engraved on the inside. Emily Thornton, and the date of your 3rd birthday, April 18th, 2018. With shaking hands, Sophie removed the bracelet and looked at the inside plate. Her eyes widened as she saw the engraving she had never thought to examine before. The name Emily Thornton was clearly visible, along with the date. She looked up at Richard, then at Margaret, then back at the bracelet. "I do not remember any of this," she said, her voice breaking. "I do not remember being... Emily, I do not remember a garden or a big house or you. I only remember being Sophie, living with Mom in different apartments, always moving, always hiding." "Why were we always hiding, Mom?" Margaret's face crumpled. "Because I was afraid of being caught, afraid of losing you, afraid of you finding out the truth. We moved cities, changed your appearance, avoided making close friends or connections. I told myself I was protecting you, but really, I was just running from the consequences of what I had done. You made me work, Sophie said, a new realization dawning on her face. You made me shine shoes in the street because you said we needed money. But we needed money because you were hiding from the police, were not you? Because of what you did to me? Yes, Margaret admitted, her voice barely audible. I could not work regular jobs that required background checks. I could not apply for assistance that would create paper trails. We lived off the grid and it made everything harder. I am so sorry, Sophie. I am sorry for all of it. Sophie turned away from both of them, walking to the window. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the street below, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Richard and Margaret remained where they were, giving her space to process, though every instinct in Richard screamed to go to her and hold her. Finally, Sophie spoke without turning around. I need to see proof. I need to see pictures, videos, something that shows me I was really this Emily person you say I was. Of course, Richard said immediately. I brought some things with me. They are in my car. I can go get them right now if you want. Sophie nodded, still facing the window. Richard quickly left the apartment, grateful for James, who was waiting outside with a box Richard had prepared for this exact moment. Inside were photo albums, printed pictures, a flash drive with videos, and several of Emily's favorite toys that Richard had kept all these years. When he returned, Sophie had moved to sit at the small dining table. Her face was blotchy from crying, but her expression was determined. She wanted answers, and she would look at the evidence with the same careful attention she gave to her math homework. Richard opened the first photo album and placed it in front of her. Sophie leaned over it, studying the pictures of a small girl with dark hair who looked remarkably like her. There was the girl as a newborn, as a toddler learning to walk, as a little child playing with toys. And in many of the pictures was Richard, younger and happier, holding the girl, playing with her, smiling at her with obvious love. That is me? Sophie asked, her finger hovering over a picture of the toddler in a pink dress. That is you, Richard confirmed. That picture was taken at your second birthday party. You got frosting all over your face and loved it. Sophie flipped through more pages, seeing herself in places she did not remember, with people she did not know. There was a woman in many of the photos, beautiful and smiling, always holding or playing with little Emily. Who is she? Sophie asked, pointing to the woman. That is Catherine, your birth mother. My ex-wife, Richard said carefully. After you disappeared, the grief was too much for our marriage. We separated about a year later. She lives in California now. I have already contacted her, and she wants to meet you when you are ready. I have another mother. Sophie looked overwhelmed. I have two mothers now. You have a biological mother who carried you and gave birth to you, and you have the woman who raised you for the past 6 years, Richard said diplomatically. Both of them love you in their own ways. Sophie turned to Margaret, her eyes filled with pain. How could you do this? How could you take me away from all of this? She gestured at the photos showing a beautiful house, loving parents, birthday parties, and a life of comfort and security. Margaret had no defense to offer. I was broken, Sophie. My mind was not right. But that does not make it okay. Nothing makes it okay. Richard then pulled out a tablet and loaded a video file. This is from your 3rd birthday, the day I gave you that bracelet. Do you want to watch it? Sophie nodded hesitantly. Richard pressed play, and the small apartment filled with the sounds of a happy celebration. On the screen, 3-year-old Emily ran through a beautiful garden, chasing bubbles. Catherine laughed in the background, and Richard's voice could be heard saying, "Make a wish, princess." Little Emily blew out 3 candles on a cake, her face glowing with joy. Then Richard on the screen pulled out a small box and opened it, showing the bracelet. This is a special present for my special girl. Happy birthday, Emily. The toddler on the screen clapped her hands with delight as Richard fastened the bracelet on her tiny wrist. Pretty, she exclaimed. I love it, Daddy. I love you too, princess. Forever and always, Video Richard replied, kissing her forehead. The video ended and the apartment fell into heavy silence. Sophie was staring at the blank screen, tears flowing freely down her face now. I called you Daddy, she whispered. In the video, I called you Daddy. You did, Richard said, his own eyes wet with tears. That is what you called me. Every single day. Sophie stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back. I need to be alone. I need to think. I cannot do this right now. She ran to her small bedroom and shut the door firmly. Richard started to follow, but Margaret put a hand on his arm. Let her process. This is a lot for anyone, especially a child. She needs time. They sat in tense silence for over an hour. Richard could hear occasional sounds from Sophie's room, sometimes crying, sometimes silence. It was the hardest hour of his life, knowing his daughter was in pain and not being able to comfort her. Finally, Sophie emerged. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her face showed a strange calmness, as if she had come to some decision. She looked at Richard for a long moment, really studying him, as if trying to see past the stranger to the father he claimed to be. I need to ask you something, she said quietly. And I need you to be completely honest. Of course, if anything, Richard replied. If you could turn back time and stop this from happening, if you could have me back the way I was when I was 3 years old, living with you in that big house with that other life, would you do it? Even knowing it would erase all my memories of the past 6 years, all my memories of being Sophie? The question was profound beyond her years, and Richard considered it carefully before answering. If I could change the past, I would change what happened to you. I would have been more careful, paid more attention, never let you be taken. But I would not want to erase who you are now. Sophie and Emily are not two different people. You are one person who has had two very different chapters in her life. I want to know Sophie just as much as I miss Emily. I want to know the brave, hard-working, kind girl who shines shoes to help her mother. That girl is my daughter too, even if she does not remember being Emily. Sophie seemed to consider this answer, and something in her expression softened slightly. Can I ask you another question? As many as you want. Why did it take you so long to find me? It has been 6 years. Where were you? The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. I was looking, Sophie. Every single day I was looking. I hired investigators, followed every lead, checked every possible city. But Margaret was very good at hiding. She changed your name, your appearance, moved frequently, stayed off any official records. I never stopped searching, but I could not find you until that day 3 weeks ago when I saw that bracelet on your wrist. And now that you found me, what happens next? Sophie asked. Do I have to leave, Mom? Do I have to come live with you? What about school, my friends, everything I know? We figure it out together, Richard said. Nothing happens that you do not agree to. This is your life, and you get a say in what happens next. But Sophie, I am your father. I want to be part of your life. I want you to be part of mine. We do not have to rush, but we do need to move forward somehow. Sophie looked at Margaret, who had been sitting silently through this entire exchange. Mom, what do you want me to do? Margaret took a shaky breath. I want you to do what is best for you, sweetheart. Mr. Thornton can give you things I never could. A real home, stability, education, opportunities. He is your real father, and he loves you. I have no right to keep you from that. But I love you too, Sophie said, fresh tears falling. Even if what you did was wrong, you are still my mum. I cannot just pretend the past 6 years did not happen. And you should not have to, Richard said firmly. This situation is complicated, and there are no easy answers. But we are going to figure it out, together, all 3 of us, for your sake. Chapter 6. The Transition. The weeks that followed the revelation were some of the most challenging of Richard's life, and he had thought nothing could be harder than the 6 years of not knowing. At least then he had only his own grief to manage. Now he had to watch his daughter struggle with an identity crisis that would have been difficult for an adult, let alone a 9-year-old child. True to his word, Richard did not push. He arranged for Sophie to see Dr. Patricia Reynolds, one of the best child psychologists in New York, someone who specialized in trauma and family transitions. Dr. Reynolds met with Sophie twice a week, and separately with Richard, and even with Margaret, helping everyone navigate this impossible situation. She is remarkably resilient, Dr. Reynolds told Richard after the 3rd session, but she is also deeply confused about where she belongs and who she is supposed to be. She loves Margaret despite understanding intellectually that what happened was wrong. And she is curious about you, about her past life, but also terrified of losing everything she knows. What do I do? Richard asked, feeling helpless. How do I help her? You do exactly what you have been doing. You show up. You are patient. You let her set the pace. She needs to learn to trust you, and trust cannot be rushed. So Richard continued his routine. He visited Sophie several times a week, always at her invitation. Sometimes they met at the apartment, where the three of them would share meals that Richard provided. Other times they went to places Sophie wanted to see: museums, parks, the library. Richard was careful never to overwhelm her with expensive gifts or grand gestures. Instead, he focused on presence, on listening, on slowly building a relationship. Sophie began asking him questions about her early childhood. What was her favorite toy? What songs did he sing to her? Did she have any pets? Richard answered each question with patience, often showing her photos or videos to support his stories. Gradually, he saw something shift in her eyes. She was beginning to believe, truly believe, that she had once been Emily Thornton. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the revelation, Sophie surprised him with a request. "Can we go see the house? The one where I lived before?" Richard's heart leapt. "Of course. Whenever you want." They drove to the Westchester estate the following Saturday. Richard had kept the property all these years, unable to sell it despite the painful memories. As they pulled up the long driveway, Sophie pressed her face to the window, staring at the large colonial house with wide eyes. "It is really big," she whispered. "I lived here?" "You did. This was your home for the first 3 years of your life," Richard confirmed. He gave her a tour of the house, which had been maintained by a caretaker but remained largely unchanged from 6 years ago. Sophie wandered through the rooms with a strange expression, as if she were trying to remember something just out of reach. When they got to what had been her nursery, preserved exactly as it had been, she stopped in the doorway. The room was painted soft lavender, with white furniture and shelves full of toys and books. A rocking horse sat in one corner, and the walls were decorated with hand-painted butterflies. Sophie stepped inside slowly, running her fingers along the bookshelf. "Pink elephant," she said suddenly, pulling a stuffed animal from the shelf. "I remember this, I think. Or maybe I'm just imagining it because of the pictures you showed me." "That was your favorite," Richard said softly. "You took it everywhere. You called it Peanut." Sophie hugged the elephant to her chest. "Peanut," she repeated. "That sounds right." "That sounds familiar." They went outside to the garden, and Sophie walked the paths with increasing speed, as if her feet remembered, even if her mind did not. She stopped in front of the rose bushes, the fountain, the bench under the oak tree. "I drew this," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "The picture I showed you of the garden I dreamed about. This is it. I have been dreaming about my own home all this time and did not even know it." Richard felt tears building but held them back. "Some part of you remembered. Deep down you knew." Sophie turned to him, and for the first time there was something new in her expression when she looked at him. Recognition, connection. "I think I am starting to remember you too. Not memories exactly, but feelings. When I'm with you, sometimes I feel safe in a way that is different from anything else. Like my heart knows you even if my brain does not." It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to Richard. He knelt down to Sophie's level. "Your heart is smart. Trust it." Sophie surprised him by stepping forward and hugging him. It was brief and tentative, but it was real. Richard held her gently, careful not to squeeze too tight, not to scare her away. When she pulled back, there were tears on her cheeks. "This is all so confusing," she admitted. "I do not know who I'm supposed to be anymore." "You are supposed to be exactly who you are," Richard told her. "You do not have to choose between being Sophie and being Emily. You are both. You are my daughter, and you are the girl Margaret raised. All of that is part of you now." Back in the city, the situation with Margaret was becoming more complicated. Her health was deteriorating rapidly, and it was becoming harder to hide the severity from Sophie. Richard found himself in the strange position of helping the woman who had destroyed his life, arranging for medical care and pain management, because Sophie needed her mother to be as comfortable as possible. One evening, when Sophie was at school for a late study group, Richard met with Margaret at the apartment. She looked frail, her skin pale and her movements slow. He found himself feeling an unwelcome surge of sympathy. "Thank you for the medical help," Margaret said. "You did not have to do that." "I did not do it for you," Richard replied honestly. "I did it for Sophie. She does not need to watch you suffer more than necessary. I know, but I am grateful anyway. Margaret paused, gathering her strength. I need to talk to you about what happens when I am gone. The doctors say it will be soon. Maybe 2 months, possibly less. Richard sat down heavily. He had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly was still shocking. Have you told Sophie? Not the timeline. But I need to soon. She deserves to be prepared. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I am going to lose her, Richard. Not just to you, but to everything. And I know I deserve it. I know this is the consequence of what I did. But it still breaks my heart. Do you have any family? Anyone who should be notified? Richard asked. Margaret shook her head. No one. My parents passed away years ago. No siblings. No other children. Sophie is all I have. She has been my whole world for 6 years. Then we make the most of the time you have left, Richard said quietly. Sophie needs you to be strong for her right now. She needs you to help her transition to a new life. Can you do that? I will try, Margaret promised. It is the least I can do after everything I have taken from both of you. They sat in silence for a moment before Margaret spoke again. Will you tell her the whole truth about me? About the woman I was before I took her? What do you mean? I was not always this person, this criminal. I was a good employee. You trusted me with your daughter. I had dreams, plans, a whole life ahead of me. And then in one moment of madness, I threw it all away. I became someone I never thought I could be. I do not want Sophie to only remember me as the woman who kidnapped her. I want her to understand that people are complicated, that one terrible choice does not erase all the good that came before or after. Richard considered this. I will tell her the truth, all of it, the good and the bad. She deserves to know everything. A month later, Margaret finally told Sophie about the timeline. They were sitting together on the couch watching an old movie when Margaret muted the television and turned to her daughter. Sophie, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about my illness. Sophie's face immediately showed concern. Are you feeling worse? Should we go to the hospital? No, baby, but I need you to understand that I am not going to get better. The treatment is helping me manage the pain, but my body is still getting weaker. The doctors say I probably have about a month left, maybe a little more. The blood drained from Sophie's face. A month? You mean you are going to be gone? Forever? Margaret pulled Sophie close, holding her, as the girl began to sob. I am so sorry, sweetheart. I am so sorry for all of this. I am sorry for taking you, for lying to you, and now for leaving you. None of this is fair. I do not want you to go, Sophie cried. I do not care what you did. You are still my mom. You are still the person who raised me and loved me and took care of me. I do not want to lose you. I know, baby. I know. But you are going to be okay. You have Richard now. He loves you so much, and he is going to take such good care of you. And you have your birth mother, Catherine, who wants to know you. You are going to have a family, a real family, the kind I could never give you. But I want you too, Sophie insisted. Why does it have to be one or the other? Because life is not always fair, Margaret said softly. But I want you to promise me something. Promise me that you will let yourself be happy. Do not carry guilt about moving on. Do not feel like you are betraying me by loving Richard and building a life with him. Promise me you will take advantage of all the opportunities he can give you. Be the amazing person I know you can be. Sophie cried for a long time, clinging to Margaret. Eventually, exhausted from emotion, she fell asleep on the couch. Margaret sat there holding her, memorizing the weight of her child in her arms, knowing these moments were numbered now. Richard arrived an hour later, having been called by Margaret. He looked at the sleeping child, at Margaret's tear-stained face, and understood immediately that Sophie knew. She took it hard, Margaret said unnecessarily. Of course she did. She is losing her mother. The words came out without bitterness, just sad acknowledgement of the truth. Will you take her home with you tonight? I think she needs some space and I need to rest. Richard nodded and carefully lifted Sophie into his arms. She stirred slightly but did not wake, instinctively curling against his chest in a way that made his heart ache, with both joy and sorrow. He carried his daughter out to his car, placed her gently in the back seat, and drove through the quiet city streets toward the home that would now become hers. Sophie woke up the next morning in an enormous bed in a beautiful bedroom filled with morning light. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing her surroundings. Then she remembered. The conversation with Margaret, crying herself to sleep and then nothing. She must have been brought to Richard's penthouse. She got out of bed and explored the space. The room was elegant but not overly decorated, leaving plenty of space for her to make it her own. Through the windows, she could see the Manhattan skyline stretching out in all directions. It was beautiful, but it felt surreal, like someone else's life, not hers. There was a soft knock on the door. "Sophie, are you awake?" Richard's voice was gentle. "Yes, you can come in." Richard entered carrying a tray with breakfast. "I was not sure what you liked, so I made a little bit of everything. Pancakes, eggs, fruit toast, and hot chocolate, because I remember that used to be your favorite." Sophie looked at the spread and felt something break inside her. "Margaret always made me oatmeal because it was cheap and filling. We never had pancakes unless someone gave us extra food." "You can have pancakes every day if you want," Richard said, "and anything else you want. This is your home now too, Sophie." "Is it?" Sophie asked quietly. "Or am I just a guest here until I figure out how to be Emily again?" Richard set down the tray and sat on the edge of the bed. "You are not a guest. You are my daughter, and this is your home. Whether you call yourself Sophie or Emily or anything else, that does not change. And you do not have to become someone you are not. I fell in love with Sophie just as much as I loved Emily. You do not have to choose." Sophie picked at the food, her appetite minimal despite the beautiful presentation. "Everything is changing so fast. A few months ago, my biggest worry was making enough money to pay rent. Now I am living in a penthouse with a father I barely remember, and watching my mum slowly pass away. How am I supposed to handle all of this?" "One day at a time," Richard said. "And you do not have to handle it alone. I am here, Dr. Reynolds is here, and for as long as Margaret has, she is here too. We are all going to help you through this." "Can I still see her? Every day?" Sophie asked anxiously. "Every single day if you want. I will drive you there myself." And he did. Every afternoon after school, Richard took Sophie to visit Margaret. They would spend hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Margaret grew weaker, but she made the most of every moment, telling Sophie stories about their time together, apologizing repeatedly for her mistakes, and constantly encouraging Sophie to embrace her new life with Richard. Chapter 7. Coming Home. Margaret passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, exactly 5 weeks after telling Sophie about her prognosis. Sophie had spent the previous night at the apartment, curled up beside Margaret's bed holding her hand. Richard had stayed too, sleeping in the living room chair, making sure they were not alone during those final hours. As the first light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains, Margaret opened her eyes one last time and looked at Sophie. "My beautiful girl," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You are going to do amazing things. I am so proud of you." "I love you, Mum," Sophie said through tears. "Thank you for everything. Thank you for loving me. Love is never wrong, sweetheart. Remember that. The way we came together was wrong, but the love was always real." Margaret's eyes drifted closed. "Tell Richard I am sorry. Tell him thank you for giving me these last weeks with you." "You can tell him yourself," Sophie said desperately, but she knew the truth. Margaret's breathing had become shallow and irregular. Richard appeared in the doorway, somehow knowing this was the moment. He came to stand beside Sophie, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Together they watched as Margaret took her last breath, her face finally peaceful after so many months of pain. Sophie did not cry immediately. She sat there holding Margaret's hand, processing the finality of it all. When Richard gently suggested they call the appropriate people, Sophie finally let go and turned to him. He opened his arms and she collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably. "I have got you," Richard murmured, holding his daughter close. "I have got you, and I am never letting go again." The next few weeks were difficult. Sophie struggled with grief and guilt in equal measure. She cried for the woman who had raised her, but also felt guilty for mourning someone who had committed such a terrible act against her real family. Dr. Reynolds helped her understand that both feelings were valid, that she could grieve Margaret, while also acknowledging the wrong that had been done. Richard never spoke badly of Margaret during this time. He understood that Sophie needed to process her complicated feelings without him adding to the burden. He simply provided stability, love, and unwavering support. At Margaret's small memorial service, Attended by only a handful of neighbors and Sophie's schoolteacher, Richard stood beside his daughter as she read a letter she had written. Her voice shook but remained strong. Margaret Mitchell was a complicated person who made a terrible mistake, but she was also a person who showed me love every single day. She taught me to be kind, to work hard, and to never give up. I do not have to agree with what she did to appreciate who she was to me. She was my mother for 6 years, and that will always be part of my story. As they left the cemetery, Sophie reached for Richard's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. She was choosing to move forward, to build a relationship with him, to find her place in this new life. The transition was not always smooth. There were hard days when Sophie felt lost between two identities. She started going by both names, Sophie to her friends and some family, Emily to others who had known her before. Eventually, she settled on Emily Sophie Thornton, a name that honored both parts of her journey. Richard introduced her slowly to Catherine, her birth mother, who flew in from California. That reunion was emotional and challenging in different ways. Catherine broke down at the sight of her daughter, overwhelmed with joy and grief. Emily found it harder to connect with Catherine, who was essentially a stranger. But over time, they built a relationship based on weekly video calls and monthly visits. Richard enrolled Emily in a private school, where she could get extra support for the gaps in her education. From her years of inconsistent schooling, she threw herself into her studies with the same determination she had once applied to shining shoes. Teachers were amazed by her work ethic and resilience. As the months turned into years, Emily blossomed. She joined the debate team, discovered a passion for social justice, and maintained the top grades in her class. She never forgot where she came from, never forgot the girl who had worked on the streets, never forgot Margaret. Those experiences shaped her perspective and her purpose. When it came time to apply to colleges, Emily wrote her admissions essay about her unusual journey. She was honest about the kidnapping, about losing Margaret, about reconciling two different childhoods. The essay was powerful and authentic, and it helped her gain admission to Columbia University on a full scholarship. Richard attended every significant moment of her high school years. Every play, every debate tournament, every award ceremony. He cheered the loudest, cried the most openly, and made sure Emily knew she was loved unconditionally. Their relationship had grown strong, built on patience, trust, and mutual respect. The summer before college, Emily made a decision. She visited the old apartment building where she had lived with Margaret. It had new tenants now, but she stood outside, remembering. She thought about the scared 9-year-old girl who had learned her whole life was a lie, and she felt proud of how far she had come. College brought new challenges and opportunities. Emily declared a major in law with a focus on family justice. She wanted to help other children who found themselves in impossible situations, caught between different families, different identities, different truths. Her personal experience gave her a unique perspective that professors and fellow students found invaluable. Throughout law school, Emily maintained her close relationship with Richard. They had dinner together at least once a week, talking about her cases, her dreams, her fears. He had become not just her father, but her mentor and best friend. Catherine also remained part of her life, visiting several times a year and providing a different kind of maternal support. Emily graduated from law school at the top of her class. She had job offers from prestigious firms across the country, but she chose to work for a non-profit organization that specialized in family law and child advocacy. The pay was modest compared to what she could have earned elsewhere, but the work aligned with her values. The day she was admitted to the New York State Bar was one of the proudest of Richard's life. He sat in the audience with Catherine, both of them beaming as Emily stood before the judge and took her oath. She looked confident, capable, and completely herself, a perfect blend of the privileged child she had been born as and the hard-working girl she had become. A month after her admission, Emily was invited to speak at a family law conference. The topic was complex family dynamics and trauma-informed advocacy. As she stood at the podium, looking out at the audience of lawyers, judges, and social workers, she thought about her journey and decided to share something personal. "Before I begin my prepared remarks, I want to tell you a story," Emily said, her voice clear and strong. "When I was 9 years old, I was shining shoes on a street corner in Manhattan to help support my family. One day a man sat down on my bench and asked for a shoe shine. I had no idea that this encounter would change my life forever. She paused, seeing the curious faces in the audience. That man was my biological father, though I did not know it at the time. I had been taken from my family when I was 3 years old and raised by someone else under a different name. For 6 years I had no idea who I really was. That afternoon on the street corner, when my father recognized a bracelet I was wearing, set in motion a series of events that would tear apart the only world I knew and rebuild it into something completely different. The room was silent, everyone captivated by her story. Emily continued, describing her journey without revealing unnecessary private details. She talked about the confusion, the grief, the complicated emotions of loving 2 mothers, of reconciling 2 childhoods, of finding herself in the space between 2 identities. I am standing here today because of love, Emily concluded. Not perfect love, not simple love, but persistent love. My father never stopped looking for me, never stopped hoping. When he found me, he did not try to erase the 6 years I had spent away from him. He embraced all of me, Sophie and Emily both. He taught me that you can acknowledge wrong while still honoring the complicated humanity of all involved. He showed me that true love survives adversity, overcomes betrayal, and finds a way home even when the path is impossible. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes finding Richard in the audience. He was openly crying, as was Catherine beside him. One day a man sat at my shoe shine stand and let me see that parental love can survive separation, can survive lies, can survive anything. Because real love, true love, always finds its way back. And that is what I hope to bring to my work. That understanding that families are complicated, that love is complicated, but that healing is always possible when we approach each situation with patience, compassion, and unwavering commitment. The audience erupted in applause. After the conference, several people approached Emily to thank her for her honesty and to share their own complex family stories. She listened to each one with the empathy that had been born from her own experience. That evening, Emily, Richard, and Catherine had dinner together at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan. It was a rare occasion when all 3 of them were in the same city at the same time, and they wanted to celebrate Emily's success. "I'm so incredibly proud of you," Richard said, raising his glass. "Not just for your accomplishments, though those are remarkable, but for the person you have become. You took an impossible situation and turned it into your purpose. You took pain and transformed it into compassion. You are everything I hoped you would be and so much more." "I could not have done it without you," Emily said. "Both of you. You gave me life, Catherine. And you, Dad, you gave me my life back. You both taught me different things about love, about family, about perseverance. I carry both of you with me every day." "And Margaret?" Catherine asked gently. It had taken years, but she had eventually made peace with the complicated role Margaret had played in Emily's life. Emily was quiet for a moment, thinking about the woman who had raised her, who had loved her imperfectly but genuinely. "I carry her with me too. She taught me about resilience, about working hard, about finding joy in small things. She made terrible choices, but she also showed me love in the only way she knew how. I can acknowledge both truths now." They talked late into the evening, 3 people bound together by biology, by history, by choice. Emily looked at her 2 parents and felt, for the first time in years, completely whole. She was not just Sophie, not just Emily, but a complete person who had taken the broken pieces of her story and created something beautiful. As they left the restaurant, Richard pulled Emily aside. "I want to show you something." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was the bracelet, the white gold bracelet with her name engraved inside, the bracelet that had started everything. "I thought you might want this back," Richard said. "It brought you home once. Maybe it can remind you that you always have a home with me." Emily took the bracelet with trembling hands. She had not worn it since that day when she discovered the truth engraved inside. Now as she fastened it around her wrist, it felt different. Not like a remnant of a stolen past, but like a bridge between who she had been and who she had become. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "For never giving up. For finding me. For loving me through all of this." "Thank you for coming home," Richard replied. "Thank you for being brave enough to build a relationship with me, even when it was hard. Thank you for being my daughter." Years later, Emily would look back on that evening as a turning point. The moment when she fully accepted her entire story, the good and the bad, the painful and the beautiful. She would go on to help hundreds of families navigate their own complicated situations, always bringing the hard-won wisdom of someone who had lived through the impossible and emerged stronger. She kept the bracelet, wearing it on special occasions as a reminder, not of what had been taken, but of what had been found. Not of the lie, but of the truth. Not of the separation, but of the reunion. It was a symbol of her father's love. Yes, but also of her own journey, of her resilience, of her capacity to hold complicated truths and still move forward. And whenever young lawyers or social workers asked her how she managed to stay compassionate despite her own traumatic experience, Emily would simply smile and say what her father had once told her. Love is never simple, but it is always worth fighting for. Every child deserves someone who will never stop looking, never stop hoping, never stop believing that home is waiting for them, no matter how long the journey takes.